So, everybody, welcome to our first podcast of Foreign Policy Forum, a newly founded organization that believes that foreign policy themes matter and we need and want to discuss them in the public. Our first topic of our podcast will be the 100-year anniversary of Chinese Communist Party, and today with me is one of the most relevant experts in this field with more than 30 years of experience covering the Chinese foreign and domestic policy, Ms. Zorana Bakovic. Welcome.
Thank you.
Hi, how are you?
Thanks, how are you?
I'm very excited. This is our first podcast, and I hope that we will make it interesting and relevant for our viewers, and to have many more to come in the future.
So do I.
Okay, so I would like just to have a brief introduction to what are the themes and the questions that we will deal today in this podcast. So we will start with the question of what was the reason that China became a communist state, what pushed Mao Zedong to the leading position, which was kind of a surprise in how the turn of events actually came to place, and what are the phases of Communist Party since the foundation of coming to power in 1949. And we will talk about the period of 1980s and the divergence of Communist Party from the path that Soviet Communist Party took, which was very different, and how did China deal with the calls of democratization in the late 1980s, and what really happened, why didn't the events took place in Europe, for example, and around the world, why didn't it happen in China? We will then move more to this current perspective and politics of Xi Jinping, and we will talk what can we expect in the near future. And this is a treat for me, I think, the question of how the Communist Party of China actually works. You have a great experience and very good insight in that question, so this will be our last and very, very interesting question. So I really hope that you will stay with us till the end to hear what Zorana has to say on that subject. So can we just get a little bit to know your work and experience so far, just briefly, maybe for this introduction?
Yes, sure. I went to China very early in 1977, and actually I constantly deal with the Communist Party of China, because in those days, and actually in the most period of the Chinese modern history, Communist Party equals state and state equals Communist Party. But just to ease up the mood here, I would like to tell you a story from year 2004, when I was visiting a small town in Jiangsu province, Zhougao, which is famous for above average number of centenarians, people who live 100 and up. And I talked to a lady whose name was Ding Yuzhen, very skinny but very energetic woman who at the time was 104 years old. And very proudly she pointed her finger up and said that her biggest life wish was fulfilled when she joined the Communist Party in her old age. So I asked her why not earlier, why did she wait so long? And she explained to me that she was illiterate and that Communist Party was very selective and wouldn't accept anyone and wouldn't admit anyone who didn't have education. When she had turned 100, she thought, well, now I am some kind of an asset, and she applied, and then the procedure went as it usually goes, and I will open this story about the Communist Party with explaining you this procedure, which I think is kind of interesting because it also tells you how different Communist Party of China is from other communist parties around the world that we know. So Mrs. Deng had to make someone write her application because she couldn't write herself. So she asked someone to write the application, submit it to the local party cell, and then she was accepted as a candidate. The party cell appointed 2 party members as mentors and supervisors who during the next year, the whole year period, supervised her preparation, and that meant that Deng Yuzhen had to complete course in Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought and guidelines of the Communist Party, as well as current political developments in the country and around the world. And after that, she could officially apply for the membership. And the party cell had to verify her political commitment by interviewing at least 8 of her neighbors or relatives or people who knew her, so that she could be accepted as the official candidate, with 2 guarantors or mentors who were named during the 6 months of period needed for investigating her background, her commitment and moral integrity. And after that, she got 1 year of trial membership, during which she had to already pay her membership fee. And membership fee in China goes between 0.5 and 2% of annual income of every member, which depends, of course, on the level of income that that the member gets. So when she finished this trial year, she had to prove that she hasn't breached any party discipline rules and that she stayed committed to the policy of the Communist Party. And with her 102, she was officially admitted and became the party member. And this red booklet, which is actually the membership booklet, was the most precious thing that she had under her jacket, and she was very proud of it. So when I thought of those people who were all centenarians, 100 and something, these days it reminded me that now we have this very strong centenarian, and this is Chinese Communist Party, which is going to turn 100 in July. Officially, we took it, we make it, or they made it July 1st, but actually the Chinese Communist Party was founded sometime during July, when the first members, founders, gathered in Shanghai and held the first founding meeting. And it was most probably July 23rd, but regardless, Mao Zedong remembered July 1st, and he established this date as the birthday of the Communist Party. So we have very strong centenarian, very energetic, very relevant. And what we would like to know now is how this centenarian is behaving, thinking, and what is going to happen with it. And this is why we are here to talk about it.
Yeah, great introduction. The first question that came to me, if something changed in the recent times, maybe she could do it now online or something, no?
No, all this investigation and direct contact with the neighbors is still like it has always been. And all the China is highly digitalized country, and you would be very surprised if you would be there. It's much more digitalized than many countries in Europe. Still, some things, and especially party things, have to be personal. And this personal witnesses of candidates' moral integrity is out of question. It has to be very personal.
Personal touch is very important. What was the reason that China, as an Asian country, with long civilization and strong tradition, became a communist state, having been an empire for more than 2,000 years?
Well, let me start from the question why a Communist Party was established in China in the first place. we all know that Chinese Empire, the last dynasty, Qing dynasty, lasted till 1911. It was overthrown in 1911, and the First Republic was established in 1912. And the man who was behind the First Republic of China was Sun Yat-sen, who was a person who introduced principles basically imported from the West. And these three principles were democracy, socialism, and nationalism. None of this was actually very familiar in the Chinese society, and especially among the Chinese masses. But the 20th century in China was a century of great experiment. They experimented with everything, with post-emperor state, which were searching for paths further on, and with importing different nouns and philosophies and categories of modernism from Japan and the West, inspired by Japanese Meiji period and of course by many European developments in Europe, including of course Soviet Union and revolution, communist revolution which happened there. Sun Yat-sen, of course, was a very remarkable, impressive person. And his first task was to pull China off poverty and this very unprivileged position in the relations with the Western countries, because after two opium wars, which have been lost to Western countries, China was feeling like somebody or a state which was pushed into this long period of humiliation. Part of its territory was colonized, and foreign forces who Chinese considered barbarians came with two Chinese inventions. One was compass, thanks to which British navigated to the Chinese shores, and another was bronze that British and French and other European powers made powerful guns from, and defeated any attempt of China to defend itself from the globalization, which in those days was actually taking...
That's the irony of the story. Yeah.
Indeed. Well, among other ideas, especially during the movement of 1919, which was started by Chinese intellectuals, was of course how to resolve the issue of social justice. And there were Chinese intellectuals who were playing with Leninist and Marxist ideas, and they were contacted and recruited by the Soviet Union party delegates who were sent to China to establish something like Communist Party. Communist Party of Soviet Union never really thought highly of Communist Party of Chinese communists. They actually kept their eye on Sun Yat-sen, and they wanted Sun Yat-sen to reform Kuomintang, which is nationalist party that he was heading at those days, and to incorporate communists, which already started organizing themselves in different Chinese provinces and cities. And when those Chinese intellectuals, namely Li Dazhao and Chen Douxiu, gathered about 50 people in Shanghai in July 1921 and established the first Communist Party, the first task that Soviet Union Communist Party put before them and Kuomintang was to integrate and to work together, which actually happened very soon afterwards. And this first united front started only a few years after establishment of the Communist Party. Interestingly enough, Marx and Engels in their works never really wrote about China. They never thought that China would be the place where communism would become strong and prevailing ideology. And that was because China was a feudal country. Yeah. So there was no basic precondition for forming...
Clash of the classes. Yeah.
Likewise, Mao Zedong, who at the time when Chinese Communist Party was established was just a very low-profile communist activist from his Hunan province, he never really read Marx or Lenin. And he was not really familiar with any of their works. But after this first attempt to make some kind of communist party mixed with nationalist party, relying on the left teaching of Sun Yat-sen, Mao Zedong was the first one who remembered one old saying of China that says that no revolution can succeed in this country without large support of intellectuals and peasants. He understood that instructions of the Soviet communists who came to ask Chinese communists to organize general strike of workers and to spread communist ideas in the cities was actually irrelevant in the country where he counted those kind of people, which means urbanites, working class, in those days numbered no more than 2 million. And he started making campaigns in the countryside. And actually, he was the first one who understood that communism of China has to start from another point. Being not at all industrialized, being very poor, and with very few cities. Actually, Shanghai was the only industrial city in these years. Mao Zedong went down to the countryside and started gathering peasants and their support. And to make this part of the story shorter, with a couple of attempts to cooperate between Kuomintang and Communist Party, Mao went in between and actually went his way. All those attempts failed. They were successful only in a very short period when China faced enemy like Japan or warlords in the north. But basically there was no, especially after Sun Yat-sen died and Jiang Jieshi, whom we called Chiang Kai-shek, replaced him on top of Kuomintang, it couldn't work anymore. So Mao Zedong imposed himself as somebody who understood where the power of people lies, and he established Peasants' Communist Party and also Peasants' Army, which was able actually to withstand all difficulties and troubles and ordeals of long march, fights against very powerful Japanese army, and in the end, 5 years of civil war between communist forces and Kuomintang military.
That's interesting. So in those beginnings of Mao Zedong's early political career, he was really not a prominent member of the party. Or what would you say? What really pushed him to the top, to the leading position?
Well, exactly these couple of critical moments when China was losing the war against Japan, Kuomintang was exhausted, and also by that time. Kuomintang was quite corrupted party and couldn't really mobilize a large number of people who would go willingly and enthusiastically and fight against Japanese. There was one very remarkable meeting between Mao Zedong and then Japanese Prime Minister Tanaka in '72, when Mao thanks Tanaka and said, "We have to thank Japan for bringing us to power." And he was very confused. Tanaka didn't understand what he was talking about. And then Mao explained, had we not been in war with you, we wouldn't have very slim chances to beat Kuomintang. But actually, this is what made him come to power. Crisis of Kuomintang, which was multiplied by huge poverty, corruption, still very spread opium addiction, and long-lasting conflict with very powerful Japanese army. On the other hand, Mao, who went down to the countryside, mobilized peasants, like my Mrs. Ding Yuzhen, illiterate people who didn't really have value in that society, all of a sudden joined in, and he was able to organize a couple of Soviet republics. One of them was actually Free Republic of Yan'an, where he established himself as the supreme leader of the communists. And with a couple of people who were really great military strategists, including Deng Xiaoping himself, he was able to beat the Kuomintang army in the civil war and push Chiang Kai-shek together with his followers to then Formosa or Taiwan and established People's Republic of China on October 1st, 1949.
That's interesting. So he was really good in building a grassroots movement, and also he did well with responding to the threat and having this strong enemy that mobilized the masses on arms and really clinging on the power by his military advances and strategies and his military goals.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So. I have to tell you, you probably heard about Feng Youlan, who was one of the greatest Chinese philosophers, and some people in the West say that he was the first Chinese philosopher. He lived till 1990, and I interviewed him a year before his death. He was really impressive, very remarkable old gentleman then, and I asked him what he thought of Mao Zedong, with whom, especially with Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, he was in really unpleasant conflict because they forced him to rewrite his history of Chinese philosophy, and etc., as it went on during those years of great Cultural Revolution. And Feng Youlan, to my surprise, said that he had big respect for Mao. Why? Because he said Mao was the only person who understood Feng Youlan's philosophy of villages encircling cities. Feng Youlan actually was very much, his philosophy was based on historical dialectics, which has roots in Taoism. And Mao went back to Taoism and Feng Youlan's teaching to withdraw these ideas of how things have to develop if you behave in a certain way, and what is actually, where is this power of your will and of your teaching. And villages encircling cities meant that you mobilized village and encircled city so that bourgeoisie, which was very tiny and not really influential in China in those days, had to follow. And this is actually what was Mao's wisdom.
And that's very interesting. So maybe could you tell us more about how should we think about the Communist Party as the ruling party now, and can you maybe this period of 100 years move and divide into some phases so that have some specifics in them?
Indeed, we can follow Communist Party as one line with one goal, and this goal has not changed actually since the establishment of the party till now. But we also can observe how it went on in phases, because there was not one moment when this Communist Party was united. It was always split into different factions. And despite the fact that one of the most often used word in the constitution of Communist Party is Tuanjie, which means unity, there was no unity in Communist Party whatsoever. When before Mao became chairman, before he established People's Republic of China, he played with different ideas, including anarchism, and he started to, he learned a lot from Stalin. Basically, the sources of his communist ideology were Lenin and Stalin, because he didn't go back to Marx and Engels, as I said. But once he took the power in '49, it all started it started going in different way. First, Mao inherited a country which was known by the nickname of sick man of Asia. But China was really sick. China suffered for a couple of endemic epidemics. And first, what Mao had to provide was health service and cure the people. Secondly, he had to liberate, or as Chinese say, emancipate women, because women had bound feet. And despite the fact that even some emperors like Qianlong and Kanxi tried to forbid feet bounding, because not only that it was cruel and inhuman, but also it cut labor force by half. That was only Mao who succeeded forbidding it forever. Then he had to change very basic laws like marriage law to end polygamy, because Chinese men were allowed to have 4 wives before Mao, and he made women proud if they divorced, because he wanted women to get rid of this obligation to get married and to become independent and equal part of the society. And he also had to finish this opium addiction, which was really tough task. So he really came as a kind of savior. And when I was talking to Mrs. Ding Yuzhen, when she was telling me about her childhood, which was in her mind remembered by the taste of grass and tree leaves, because very often the family didn't have anything else to eat but grass and tree leaves. For this kind of peasants and poor people in China, Mao came almost as a god. But what he did in the very beginning, he promised peasants that he would give them land. He engaged peasants in overthrowing and very often killing landlords. And it was enough for a landlord, for a person to have 1/4 of a hectare of land to be called landlord, and to be taken out in front of the masses, beaten up, very often killed. Some 8 million of landlords were killed in the first years of People's Republic of China. And in this way, what Mao did was he made nobody innocent. So everyone in that country had blood on his or her hands. And this is how it started. It was kind of blackmail, which went on and on and on, stage by stage. Land never became property of peasants. Even now, not a person can own land. Land in entire area of 9.6 million square kilometers belongs to the party. But Mao did solve some of the very crucial issues like dividing land to people's communes, organizing people's communes, and bringing huge enthusiasm to the people, not only to poor people and poor peasants, not only to deprived classes, but also to intellectuals who came from different countries to help building new country. In those days, it was still in the ideological documents, new democracy and new men. So this first phase lasted not very long, till mid-50s. Then Chinese communists who came among, and especially intellectuals among them, who were educated abroad and who came to China to build this new country, they got inspired by different experiences in other countries, including former Yugoslavia. And Communist Congress of 1956 and the resolution where it was first made, where the reforms of the workers' position and the system was mentioned, was a huge inspiration for many party members in China. Mao took it as a threat. And in 1958, he launched this great leap forward. As I said previously, United Kingdom, as the first enemy, rival, colonizer, and barbarian power who put a great civilization on its knees, was the kind of parameter, kind of criteria that for Mao Zedong was measure for Chinese progress and development. So he put the task of overcoming United Kingdom's industry in 2 years' time, from 58 to 60. Of course, it was disastrous. That was a big experiment, And one can say Mao didn't know lots of things. He didn't know that on one mu is a measure for area in China, which is 1/16 of a hectare. You couldn't grow 5 tons of rice or grain. But he forced it, and he let peasants spend complete entire reserves of food. And after the country was hit by a couple of years of natural disasters, very disastrous floods and unprecedented droughts, big famine started. And between 59, 60, and 62, the estimate of the Chinese scholars says that between 15 and 40 million people died either of hunger or of the consequences of famine. So this is that was the first crisis of Mao's authority, and a party split, of course. There was the faction of Liu Xiaoqi and, of course, Deng Xiaoping, who wanted real reforms, and they wanted to come out of this disastrous great leap forward through economic reforms that Mao again took as a threat. And that's how he started his great Cultural Revolution. This campaign started in the mid-60s, 64, 66, and it was something that took again a couple of millions of lives. But also it made a whole generation, a wasted generation, because few million of young Chinese, mainly from the middle school, were sent to the countryside to work with the peasants and to learn from the most revolutionary class of China, which Mao Zedong thought were peasants. Of course, it didn't lead to anything. Students didn't learn from peasants. Peasants didn't have any use of students, and actually that was really a period of kind of artificial stop of development of everything. But what I'm going to say now, I would like everybody not to understand as justification, but only explanation of Mao. Mao at the same time fought against Confucian ideology, philosophy, teaching. He fought against old culture, old tradition, and old habits, 4 olds. And he would send children to the countryside. Wife would be working in one city and husband in another, very often 1,000 kilometers apart. And they could meet at most once in 2 years. What did it mean? Well, what was the result of that? Confucian core of the Confucian teaching, family, was destroyed. And this idea of family was finally completely put aside or put behind or wherever, but it disappeared. And that was the moment when China could finally say goodbye to Confucianism. For all those thousands of years, Confucianism was the main both philosophy, religion or quasi-religion, and ideology in the Chinese society. And very often Confucianism was this obstructive force which didn't let China develop its science, despite great inventions that China had during its history, didn't let China open up to the outside world, and didn't let China make its education public and modern. So Mao came with this disastrous idea of anti-cultural revolution, which actually killed the Chinese civilization to its core. But he killed this one obstacle for the further development of China. And again, without justification, I just want to explain why that period still was pretty important for what we have in China now and what happened after Mao's death in 1976.
So that the doors of modernization opened in that period, right? Can we move a little bit forward to the 1980s and developments in that period? Maybe you can put a parallel to the Soviet Communist Party and the developments of perestroika and glasnost in that period, and the difference of policies of Chinese Communist Party in that period, and also in the late 80s, the calls from the masses, from the students, in putting more democracy into the political process of China.
So Mao Zedong dies in 1976, and his wife and other members of so-called four members gang were arrested and tried and put in prison. Deng Xiaoping re-emerges after being put aside and prosecuted 2 times. He re-emerges and he becomes actually the supreme leader without position. He always was #1 in the official structure. He was vice prime minister, but he was actually supreme leader. And he comes with one transitional period which would bring Chinese Communist Party from the phase of ideology, which marked Mao's times, to now what we have Chinese Communist Party, which is concentrated around nationalism. So in between we have Deng, and we can call him pragmatist. All of Chinese Communist Party leaders were actually big magicians, and they experimented. China was actually a big laboratory, and I could say still it is. Searching for its path is kind of doing these laboratorical experiments, putting together things which may explode or may bring new invention. Nobody never knew what would be the result, but the leaders of the Communist Party always carefully observed and were always ready to intervene if something went into a direction they didn't want. So Deng Xiaoping comes out, and in '78 he proclaims the beginning of modernization and opening up, and of course reforms. Instead of people's communes, which he ordered being closed down, he established 4 special economic zones. He goes to Japan, and all of a sudden he says, now only I understand what modern means. He goes to United States of America, and together with Jimmy Carter puts this gallant hat on his head in Texas. Let the world see him with this American hat, and let his people see him. Sending message, we are not afraid of the Americans anymore. On the contrary, we can learn how to be another America if we wanted. And Deng had this idea that there is this big capital around the world which needs place to be invested. And he decided to make place where this money would come. Of course, using, as once high official from the Chinese government told me, using what China had. He said, Arab countries had oil and we have people. So people became this main commodity that China traded with the West. But at the same time, Deng brought to the Communist Party 2 things. One was theory of 2 cats, or doctrine of 2 cats. Doesn't matter whether cat is white or black. What matters is that it catches mice. Which meant don't put the strict difference between capitalism and socialism. What we need to do is be efficient. And another thing is pu zhenlun, which meant don't discuss about socialism or capitalism. Of course, in those days, differentiation was between socialism and capitalism, not between socialism and democracy. Because in those days, there was this commonly accepted idea that capitalism goes with democracy, and that actually you cannot have development or capitalistic development without democratic system. So Deng said, we will not discuss about that. We will have first phase of socialism, which actually was communist capitalism. And he started this merge of these 2. He allowed people to earn without work, which means without labor, which means you could invest and have shares or stocks and legally earn money, or you could earn money on rent, which was actually the big revolution again. Mm-hmm. And Deng Xiaoping actually imposed a couple of new principles in the Communist Party, which were very important for the relations between the Chinese Communist Party and the Western democratic countries. Number one, he asked his high officials, party officials, not to spend more than 2 terms in their position. It was never written in the constitution of the Communist Party, but it was established as a rule that no general secretary will serve more than 2 terms, which is 10 years' time. And he started this idea and this movement of splitting party and state. So we would have Communist Party here still as a on the highest position than the state, but state became like any other state, executor of the policies, if possible with no intervention of the party. That really never worked as it was meant to work. But at least there was this attempt. And in those days, Zhao Ziyang emerged as the successor of Deng Xiaoping after Hu Yaobang failed, being too soft towards the request of the students who were hungry, learning from everything that they got from the West, from rock music, internet, new art, new philosophical discourse. And despite the fact that they didn't go in big numbers out abroad to study, but they read books, translated books, and that was really the time when Chinese young intelligentsia was very, very connected with the free world, Western world, or democratic world, call it as you want. And this is how we come slowly to the moment where this social movement, pro-democratic movement, was formed in China among not only intellectuals, but also within the Communist Party. And party was split again. They were all reformers, but we had one faction that would like to stay only in the field of economic reforms, and the other one which was convinced that these economic reforms had to be followed by democratization. And this is how we come to 1989.
In our next question, yes. So maybe you could start. Everybody knows what happened: the student protests at the Tiananmen Square and the bloody developments of the July. Sorry,
June 4th.
June 4th. Sorry, and how did China dealt and Chinese policy dealt with that? Those turns of events and how it proceeded afterwards?
Well, 1989 was actually a very interesting year. And it was also a year when Gorbachev came to China and when Sino-Soviet relations were finally normalized. Previously, Kissinger and Nixon and all American presidents after Nixon adopted this Kissinger's idea of coming closer to China so as to finalize the Cold War against Soviet Union, forcing Soviet Union to surrender, which was basically successful. So China had this privileged place in the American view of the communist world. It was communist, but still Americans were hoping that China stays stable and integral. And based on that, Deng Xiaoping became, by the year 1989, kind of double-faced person. He was in favor of progress, but very reluctant to accept any of these trends that came from, first of all, from Europe, and also from Soviet Union. He was very alert by Solidarność, because he was aware that with these reforms, industrialization all of a sudden started developing in a high speed. And all of a sudden, this working class in enterprises, working hard, wanted to have independent trade unions. And of course, from these trade unions, maybe to become political force, or at least interest community. So Deng was very suspicious about that. Then Gorbachev came with glasnost and perestroika, and Deng was even more suspicious about this idea, because he said, if we go this way, we may win the first elections if we allow our people to split into different parties. And if we accept free elections, we may win the first election, but the second one we will not win, we will lose. And Communist Party always had one of its obsessions, actually there were three. One was to provide good life for the people and to finish poverty, which actually was a huge task. China proclaimed that the task was finished only this year. Second one was to stay in power forever. And the third one is to regain the whole territory of China, which we will come a bit later to, which means to regain Taiwan as an integral part of the Chinese territory. So when Gorbachev came, students were on the square, on the streets, and Gorbachev didn't really have anyone to talk to except for Zhao Ziyang, with whom he had a very good meeting, but Zhao lasted only 1.5 months more than afterwards. What happened actually was not so much the danger that Deng Xiaoping felt from this social movement, pro-democratic movement, came not so much from the students. Students didn't really know what to do. I went to Chinese university, Beijing University, Beida, and I interviewed students who wanted to establish something new, which was actually the copy-paste of the Communist Party. They didn't really know how to go on, but what Deng was terrified of was split within the party and the army as well. And why he called troops to come to Beijing and why this massacre happened actually was out of Deng Xiaoping's fear that civil war would break out and that the party would collapse. What happened and why people who were really first shocked, then disappointed that the People's Army shot people for the first time in history, and angry that many innocent people who were just supporting students were killed. So what made them being pacified so quickly and so easily? There were a couple of things. One thing is this experience of great cultural revolution. Calling huge masses, young people to the streets, that Jiang Qing, Mao Zedong's wife, did, to go and judge about people who didn't behave well, to make this so-called street democracy, stayed in Chinese people's mind as a very bad memory of anarchy and chaos. And they didn't want again. So Chinese people in those days were not so easily sympathetic towards students who went and occupied the square, streets, and despite the fact that there was no violence, they didn't break one single window during these couple of months of demonstrations. There was this kind of also reserve, not resentment, but reserve among the Chinese citizens who thought that this is how it looked like once, not so long time ago. And they didn't like potential anarchy or chaotic situation. Another thing is that communist countries, including Czech Republic, former Yugoslavia, started splitting up. And what was obvious already very soon after the Tiananmen massacre, which means by the end of '89 and beginning of the '90s, was that this democratization went along with the very unpleasant nationalism. And Chinese were kind of not ready for that, because nationalism among Chinese still didn't exist. They didn't know how it would play out in China, which has 55 minorities and one big nation, which are Han, and then 55 national minorities, who occupy more than 60, who are only less than 10% of the population, but occupy more than 60% of the Chinese land. And they wanted to wait and see. They wanted to wait and see what happens in all our countries before they decide what they do, whether they go on with democratization or not. And Communist Party did not deny that they would follow the suit and go into the process of democratization once. But they wanted first to see what happens with us.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's the explanation on both the society level and also on the party level, and the discussions that they held in the turn of events in the Europe and Yugoslavia and Soviet Union, and this is great analysis, and thank you for this. Maybe we can now move more towards the present time and current policy of Xi. Why is the era of Xi so important, and how should we observe it? As the biggest success story of the 21st century, or the most dangerous deception behind the curtains of the current global order? What's your position on that?
Well, this is a very good question, because we still don't know. But what happens after Deng Xiaoping withdrew from, he was the first communist leader who retired, actually, is two of his successors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, were kind of transitional personalities who were first among equals, who accepted this collective leadership, and who were not really strong personalities. And they followed Deng Xiaoping's doctrine of socialism with Chinese characteristics, and develop your strength without showing it before it's time to show, and which means keep low profile in almost everything. And Chinese people started being not satisfied anymore, because at the same time there were a couple of events that Chinese people thought that their leaders should have reacted more strongly, like bombardment of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in '99, like some conflicts on the sea with the EP-3 American spy planes, and a couple of other events like this. So Xi Jinping comes to power in 2012, and he immediately starts changing it. Everybody expected that he would be a big reformer, because his father, Xi Jinping, was Deng Xiaoping's close ally, who suffered a lot under Mao because of his reformist ideas. And everybody thought that Xi Jinping would bring finally that what was needed in China, and this is reform of the industrial sector and social welfare. And till basically soon, till few years or a short period of time ago, what we had in China was this huge success based all the time on the shoulders of peasants. Because first, okay, Chinese countryside was reformed. I wouldn't say reformed, but it was deprived of any value or any meaning in this country. And those peasants who were actually without land and without anything to do in their villages came to cities to work as so-called migrant workers. And this all that China made of itself second economic power of the world was on the shoulders of that deprived class of Chinese citizens, or citizens, not citizens, but villagers. And finally, we expected that Xi Jinping would come and change it, or put this ownership of land on the agenda of Communist Party's Congress, and let those people who built that country into something totally different from Mao's time have their place and their voice and their real dignity. He started up with something totally different. He first of all said, okay, now ideology. Chinese ideology with Xi Jinping becomes nationalism. What makes Chinese person proud is that he belongs to the most populous nation, which is going to be the biggest superpower in space, on the sea, and on the land. And this nationalism is very systematically and carefully built with, of course, a couple of targets which go very, very broad around the world, but actually we can concentrate it around Taiwan, Hong Kong, and territories which China claims is Chinese, but which either were colonies or are independent state, as Taiwan actually is. So what we have in the first almost 10 years of Xi Jinping's rule is reversal. He goes back to Mao's way of ruling, but with totally different content of his doctrine. Chinese dream is something totally different from Mao Zedong's big communism. All of a sudden, what he wants China to achieve is not universal thing for the whole world, for the whole working class of universe, but this is just China and Chinese dream for the Chinese people. And he goes into this new foreign policy, which is very assertive, if not aggressive, and which abandoned Deng Xiaoping's principle of hiding light and building your strength. He goes and shows off with all what he has. New aircraft carrier, new armament, even very risky and provocative moves in South China Sea, East China Sea, where these territorial spots or issues are still not resolved. So we have now all of a sudden this mixture of Communist Party which is entering very modern times, this final phase of the 100 years program of 100 years of making China into the most modern culture, economy, and science by very anachronistic or outdated means. Centralization, strict control, censoring everything, surveilling everybody, and making some of Chinese people even ask themselves whether new cultural revolution is possible. So Chinese are not really happy with it. With whomever I spoke, they're really not happy with Xi Jinping. But we don't know whether this, what Xi Jinping is doing, is now preparation for something which we cannot see, or he's just going towards the new personality cult and revival of the Mao Zedong's times. What is important to say is that there was not one single economist in the world who predicted Chinese reforms. Not one single economist was able to see that Deng Xiaoping would put China on the path of modernization of science, industry, agronomic politics, and military. So I wouldn't be surprised that there is no anyone in the world now who cannot predict what's going on to happen in China in the next period. What we know is that Xi Jinping broke the rule of limited term in power. So he already made us know that next year, when the 20th Party Congress is going to be held, he is not going to step down as it was expected by the unwritten rules, but he made us know that he will not find his successor on time, and that he will stay on at least till 2027. This puts China in totally different position with other countries, especially European countries were thinking about China like, okay, this is a communist country, but they still have peaceful changes of the party leadership, and there is this kind of institution which maybe resembles, not completely, but we can understand it, how it works. And now all of a sudden we have again party state, which Europeans look at and don't understand whatsoever. They don't understand what's going on inside. The most optimistic scenario that we can maybe expect is, and this happened in Chinese history of the Chinese Communist Party, is that Xi Jinping is now centralizing, putting everything into his hands. He is in charge of everything, so as to be able to go back to reforms of a grand scale. Reforms which Zhao Ziyang wanted to do but was put in prison for it. Reforms that Zhu Yunji, one of the prime ministers, wanted to proceed with but couldn't. And if this happens, then of course we will have a really marvelous finale of Xi Jinping's prolonged term in power. But for now, there is no one single sign of either this or that. We are now where we are, and we have to take China as it is in the moment, maybe help it with our own behavior, opening towards the Communist Party as somebody who is ready for dialogue, but telling Communist Party how the world looks like and how the world works, so that there is limits where which Communist Party of China should not cross.
Okay, so probably the next turn of 5 years of Xi will be very, very interesting to watch and see how the things will develop. And in a way, he actually became a really big reformator of, if you can see everything that he has done so far in this period and the plans that he's trying to put in place till the 2027. It's going to be a very interesting period. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed, it is going to be very interesting. What we already have to be very careful about is that Xi Jinping, like Deng Xiaoping, observes what's going on in the world, and he sees this big skepticism in the democratic world. He sees that this question, is democracy the only way to develop, is growing among democratic countries, both old democratic countries and new ones who democratized after the collapse of the communist bloc. So what Xi is offering now to the outside world is, okay, now we see that development is not necessarily linked with democratic system. It can exist also in undemocratic party state. He also made us question what human rights are. He made us question what freedom is. He made us actually compare the level of Chinese happiness with the waning optimism in the West. So this is something which is very dangerous. But what we have to keep in mind when we deal with China is how Communist Party as the brain of China thinks and what we can expect from it. And this goes a little bit like this. Okay, China has almost 93 million party members, which means that when we go and negotiate with somebody who is head of a corporation or a company which is interested in building something or investing in Croatia or in Europe, we probably deal with the Communist Party member. And his loyalty is always to the party, not to the state, not even to the company. So the interest of the party is number one. This interest of the party in the meantime became close to the national interest. But again we come with Xi Jinping to the same equal mark between state and party, and nation and party. We don't have this division between state and the party. So among 15.6 million private enterprises in China, 75% of them established party cells. and they have party committees, which are very powerful and can have big say in business decisions. Why is it so? Simply because you only have state banks in China. You don't have private banks. And one of the state banks can give you a loan for your business in China, or can support you when you want to export or go and do construction work outside of China. So if you want to get loan, if you want to get all permits to work, then you have to be good with the state banks, which is actually run by Communist Party, if you want. And this is why private enterprises establish party cells nowadays, including some foreign companies which have branches in China, because it's much easier to talk to Communist Party people who are decided upon business, finances, and market, etc. And when we deal with China, we do deal with the Communist Party. So what we have to do is learn how it works, how it thinks, and what it really wants. And I'm not sure that we have done enough. And this is why, with this centenarian, I think we still have to deal a lot and learn a lot about it.
I hope that this is some advancement in that field, and that in the way that we can have your experience about the Communist Party of China and your analysis put in this podcast, and learn about how does the politics in China actually works. And I hope that our viewers are also satisfied with our discussion, because we actually came to the end. I had this last question that I said in the beginning that we are saving for the end, and you have already answered it about how really politics and dealing with China works in real life. So thank you very much for this discussion, and I hope that we will have some more discussion on the topic of China and Chinese foreign policy in the future. And any last words from you, maybe to our viewers? Or
well, what we are excited to see next is whether party state can become civilization state again, because this is one of the ambitions of Chinese and Xi Jinping himself. If this happens, we'll have to think all over again what communism is and what Communist Party can achieve. What is my personal biggest hope is that China as a communist state finally becomes a social state, because it still is not. I hope that China introduces all these welfare policies that are very difficult to introduce in a country like that, and that this socialism becomes a social. Without that, I don't see the point. But in any case, what is interesting to observe and to analyze and to learn and to examine is how a state in which you always have party which is above everything, and constitution of the state is less than constitution of the party, with all parallel institutions like disciplinary commission, which replaces courts and judiciary, and with all this one common ideal, which is split in so many different factions and interests, can work and can exist so long. So I very often repeat that Communist Party of China researched in great details Vatican, and actually has this as their ideal, to last as long as Vatican, and very often it behaves like it, which means that you have no idea how a pope is chosen and how what's going on in the couloirs behind the screen, and this is very important, what is really happening there. This is why I invite all our viewers and our colleagues to develop more interest in these secrets of Chinese Communist Party, which are actually very interesting and important.
Okay, I can only say on that note we can really end this discussion, and thank you again, and see you in the future.
Thank you.